She built a career around seeing what other people missed. Tiny details, subtle changes in skin texture, the difference between something harmless and something dangerous. And yet, in the middle of filming, while cameras rolled and patients waited only feet away from her, Dr. Sandra Lee nearly missed the signs that part of her own brain was dying, and what she said afterward makes you go back and look at every smiling television appearance, every calm procedure, every carefully controlled moment on camera, and wonder exactly how long the gap existed between what the audience was seeing and what her body was already trying to warn her about, because this did not begin in an emergency room. It began in the middle of an ordinary workday at her clinic in Upland, California. The lights were on. Production crews moved through the building. Patients had traveled across the country to see the woman millions of people knew as Dr. Pimple Popper. By that point, she was no longer just a dermatologist. She was a global media brand. Billions of views online, a successful television series, a skincare company, book deals, speaking engagements, the kind of schedule where stopping even briefly affects dozens of people at once. And in the middle of that routine, something changed. She suddenly felt overheated, not dramatic, not cinematic, just wrong. Her thoughts felt cloudy. Her body felt slightly disconnected. But she kept going, finished seeing patients, continued filming, moved through the day exactly the way high-functioning people often do when something feels off, but not catastrophic enough to justify shutting everything down. That sequence is deliberate because later, after doctors confirmed she had suffered an ischemic stroke, she would look back at those early symptoms differently. The heat, the discomfort, the mental fog. None of it matched the version of stroke most people imagine, and that mattered, especially for women in their 50s. Because according to neurologists, stroke symptoms in women frequently appear differently than the classic public service announcement version people expect. Not always immediate collapse, not always dramatic facial drooping. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion, sweating, confusion, restlessness, symptoms easy to dismiss as stress, hormones, overwork, or simply getting older, which in retrospect reads differently when you consider the life she had built by that point. She was working constantly, and not just working. Performing competence every single day. Patients trusted her with deeply personal insecurities. Some appeared on camera, exposing conditions they had hidden for years. They trusted her hands, her judgment, her precision. Entire production schedules revolved around her ability to stay calm under pressure. So she did what many people do. She minimized it. That word matters. Minimized, and she used that logic repeatedly. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was a hot flash. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe she simply needed rest. That word was not accidental. It was chosen by someone who had spent decades training herself to function through discomfort. But later that evening, she went to visit her parents nearby, and the symptoms became harder to explain away. Sharp pains shot through her legs. Her balance felt strange walking downstairs. Not weak exactly, just disconnected, like the signals between her brain and body were no longer arriving properly. She did not sleep that night, and by the next morning, the situation had changed completely. She looked at her left hand and realized she could not fully control it. Then she tried speaking and heard her own words come out slurred and distorted. That was the moment the possibility finally became unavoidable. Stroke, and here is the detail that lands hardest. She is a physician, not only a physician trained to recognize medical abnormalities quickly and accurately. She knew the warning signs: face drooping, arm weakness, speech problems, loss of coordination. She understood precisely what delayed treatment could mean. And even then, she nearly talked herself out of seeking help. If you have ever been on the receiving end of your own internal negotiation during a medical emergency, you understand precisely how dangerous that instinct can become. People convince themselves to wait, to monitor symptoms, to see if things improve, to avoid inconvenience, to avoid fear, but someone else saw the situation clearly immediately. Her father, also a doctor. He looked at her symptoms and told her to go to the emergency room right away. No hesitation, no discussion. And that decision likely changed the rest of her life. The MRI confirmed a full ischemic stroke. A blood clot had interrupted oxygen flow to part of her brain. Once that happens, doctors measure damage in minutes. Nearly 2 million brain cells can die every 60 seconds during an untreated stroke. There is no recovery that erases that completely. And then came the sentence that reframed everything. Part of my brain died. Short. Sentence, clinical, precise. It lands entirely on its own because suddenly the stakes become very specific for someone like her. Dermatology is built on precision, fine motor control, hand stability, communication, observation. Her entire public identity depended on those abilities, functioning perfectly, and now her left hand no longer felt normal. That is not the move of someone merely exhausted. It was neurological damage, and when she later reflected on the months leading up to the stroke, the paper trail of risk factors was already there. High blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, stress, long work hours, constant production schedules, the slow accumulation of warning signs people postpone dealing with because daily life still appears manageable until it does not. Filming stopped almost immediately. Television schedules paused. Procedures halted. Staff members suddenly faced uncertainty around a business empire built heavily around one person's physical capability. And for someone whose career depended on solving problems for other people, there was suddenly no immediate solution available for herself. But to understand why this moment hit with such force, you have to go much further back, long before television, long before YouTube, back to her father in Malaysia. Before immigrating to the United States, he worked in a rural clinic where medical resources were limited. According to Sandra Lee's own recollections, he relied heavily on a small borrowed dermatology book to identify skin diseases. He would step behind a curtain between patients, flip through pages, and attempt to diagnose conditions with minimal tools and almost no specialized support. That image matters. A doctor studying quietly behind a curtain with a borrowed book. Because decades later, his daughter would become one of the most recognizable dermatologists in the world. But her path into that field was not guaranteed at all. In fact, she initially failed to match into dermatology residency, which in retrospect becomes one of the most important moments in her story. Because audiences tend to rewrite successful careers backward as inevitable. They see the empire and assume the trajectory was smooth. It was not. She was rejected, forced to reconsider her future entirely. For a period, she explored other medical directions. The field her father had built his life around nearly closed its doors to her permanently. But she persisted, eventually completed her dermatology training, and later took over her father's practice in Southern California. And then came the decision that changed everything. In 2010, she began uploading videos to YouTube. At first, almost nobody noticed. The content was straightforward, educational, clinical, dermatology procedures explained carefully and professionally. The channel existed quietly for years before one specific type of video altered everything. Blackhead extractions. Simple concept. Unexpectedly massive audience response. Millions of viewers watched procedures they could barely tolerate and somehow could not stop watching. The internet turned her into something very few medical professionals ever become, a celebrity, and celebrity created acceleration. More videos, more patients, more filming, more travel, more pressure, a TLC television series, product lines, brand partnerships, interviews, public appearances. The pace increased continuously because the demand never stopped increasing. And underneath all of it, the physical strain kept building. That sequence is deliberate, because when successful people burn out publicly, audiences often treat the collapse as sudden. But medically, psychologically, professionally, these moments usually develop slowly over years. The body keeps records, and eventually hers forced her to stop. Recovery took months. For approximately 2 months, she stopped operating entirely. Basic movements became difficult. Walking straight required concentration. Speaking felt different. Her left hand, the hand central to her career, no longer responded with complete reliability, and the fear attached to that reality was larger than the public initially understood, because this was not simply about returning to work. It was about identity. What happens when the thing you spent your Entire life mastering suddenly feels uncertain. What happens when your hands no longer feel fully trustworthy? And what makes this more complicated is that outwardly many stroke survivors appear relatively normal during recovery. Audiences see someone speaking again, smiling again, filming again, and assume restoration is complete. But neurological injury rarely works that way. Sandra later described returning to the same clinic with a completely different psychological awareness. The same cameras, the same procedure rooms, the same production environment, but now every sensation carried different meaning because she knew firsthand how quickly normalcy could disappear. A stroke changes time,